All right, and we're back, folks. Okay, so right now we're gonna try. We're gonna get our guest, Dr. Simeon Hein. Are you ready, Mario?
I'm ready.
Okay.
I'm very ready.
Okay, let's get on our show.
Hey, Robert.
Hey, Dr. Simeon Hein. Welcome to the MnRTV Live Show. It's an honor to have you on our show tonight. We're very happy to have you on.
Yeah, where are you guys based, by the way?
We're based in Montreal, Canada.
Oh, great. Yeah. Do you want me to turn my camera on or just leave audio?
It's audio. It's audio. It's audio. So it's fine the way everything is. So
okay.
All right. So we have a lot of topics to talk about. So first of all, since your first time guest on our show, would you care to tell us about yourself, Doctor?
Oh yeah. First of all, are we? Is this a recorded show or are we live?
We're live now, and it'll be recorded on YouTube later on.
Oh, great. Hey, well, thanks for having me here tonight. And just briefly, you know, I have a PhD. I used to teach statistics and research methods in sociology. And in 1996, I came across the topic of remote viewing from Dr. Courtney Brown at the Farsight Institute in Atlanta.
Okay.
And I kind of came into this whole area. You know, I got to tell you, I had some UFO sightings as a child, you know, teenager and so forth, but it wasn't something that was really part of my life very much, any of these topics. I really had forgotten about them by the time I finished graduate school in around 1992, 93. And in 1996, I took this remote viewing course, and I kind of went in, Robert, partly as a skeptic. And it turned out to be real. I mean, I could do it after a couple of days, you know, perceive non-local information from distant targets. It was something that came out of a classified military program in the Department of Defense and the Central Intelligence Agency. And it worked just like the government found out. And that really opened me up to a lot of new topics, including what we're going to be talking about tonight, crop circles and other related phenomena.
Wow, that's amazing. So, okay, so let's get into the topics first of all of crop circles. What are crop circles, and how was that discovered? Has it been discovered? Like, what's the cause of it?
Well, it's a big, complex topic, Robert. I came across it in 1996 at the FAR. I didn't know what they were in 1996, but Dr. Courtney Brown gave us a target to view. You know, you're viewing targets that you don't have information about ahead of time. They're hidden from you. It's called, you know, blind, or it could be double blind where the monitor doesn't know about it either. We've been doing regular sorts of targets, you know, buildings and mountain ranges and landmarks and famous people. And then he threw in this picture of a crop circle. And at the time, I didn't know even what that was. But when we saw the picture later, it was a picture of the 1996 Windmill Hill in the UK, triple Julia set. And when I looked at what I'd written down, you know, it was very interesting information. And I was so curious about it, I actually went over there the next year on a crop circle tour in 1997. And what we found out at the time when I went there was, know how these are being made, what they meant, and so forth, but they certainly looked beautiful. I'm sure you're familiar with what they look like, right?
Of course, yes.
And your listeners would be, you know, familiar with they're very, you know, they're patterns in wheat and grain crops.
Yes.
And they look very symmetrical, very beautiful. And what I discovered going over there in 1997 is no one at the time knew, you know, how they were made, but there were a lot of electromagnetic and luminal anomalies that were seen in and around these formations. People's batteries and cameras would stop working. It didn't happen to me the first year I was there in 97, but I talked to people who said it happened to them and so forth. So there seemed to be something, they're really large patterns. They could be a size of a football field across, symmetrically done. And I thought the whole phenomena was quite interesting, especially all of the things that you could document around it that were unexplained. And it kind of fit with my remote viewing session, that there were kind of anomalous energies in and around the area, mostly in wheat. Over there they call it corn, but in this hemisphere we call it wheat. And they were just very interesting patterns. You could walk around in them, and there were some strange things that were happening around them.
Was there like any animal mutilations?
No, not really. I would say no.
Okay.
No, there was nothing really negative associated with them.
Oh, good.
It's just these big patterns, and you know, if listeners want to look at some of the anomalies that we were able to record, if they go to my blog, newcrystalmind.com, as part of the information on these crop circle tours that we give, I put up a link to all of the weird things I've been able to record on my video camera around crop circles. And it's mostly people's batteries, cameras, laptops, things like that. They stop working when they go into the crop circles. Because, you know, we all have these devices, right? They work pretty regularly. They're pretty predictable. You turn them on and they work.
Yes.
Well, you go in and around in a crop circle, and sometimes they just stop, or they act strangely, or the batteries completely discharge, or people's cameras, brand new cameras, start having issues and they don't work for quite a while, or maybe never again. We don't recommend that people take brand new equipment into a crop circle because we can't predict what's going to happen. I mean, Robert, I have seen camcorders melt on the inside.
Wow.
I'm not kidding. I've seen them melt on. They were sent back to Sony, and Sony said the solder had melted on the inside. Now, have you ever had that happen to your camera or camcorder? Never.
No. Would this happen to also a cell phone and a tablet?
It could happen. Yeah.
Okay.
Happen. So that was like a clue way back in the 90s that there was something about these circles, even though we didn't know at the time how they were made, that there was something about them that was absolutely real. You know what I mean? Because if they're not real, why would they affect your equipment?
That's right.
Things that are not real don't affect your equipment. It happened not every time. I'd say maybe 5% of the crop circles we went in, you'd find some of these anomalies. Really strange. It could happen to a couple of people's cameras at the same time. You know, like there was an energy field in and around the circles. I mean, regardless how you thought they were made, we didn't know back in the 90s. There wasn't any evidence. We can talk about what we learned a couple years later about some of them, but even back then we saw a lot of really strange things happening in and around the circles.
Okay, my next question would obviously be who or what is causing this?
Well, if you go back in history like 100 years, these things have been happening for a long time. And they have been associated with flying discs, UFOs, things like this. But in recent years, you're not going to find a lot of, that's pretty rare. I mean, it's documented, but it's rare. You're not going to find a lot of witnesses recently to seeing any UFOs or flying discs make them. But I mean, it has happened. The Tully saucer nests in Australia are a good example of this. They were in Australia, and people saw these discs landing and taking off in a marshy area. When they went out to explore, they found these flattened areas of grass. And similar to that, I encountered a witness recently, Louise Voves, who I'll just mention I wrote about in my most recent book called Black Swan Ghosts, which are about people who've encountered unexplained aerial phenomena and occupants and things like that. And in this person I encountered, Louise, she's passed away a couple years ago, but I was able to talk to her extensively before that. And she was picking huckleberries one day in eastern Washington state with her brother, and a disc came over. It was wobbling, as they often do, the kind of falling leaf pattern. And all of a sudden it went down to the ground and flattened all the grasses and the meadow flowers as it departed for about 100 yards in a straight direction. So here's someone I know that saw, for lack of a better word, UFO or unexplained aerial phenomena, whatever you'd like to call it, flying disc. They didn't know what to call it because she said they didn't even have the word UFO in their vocabulary in the 1970s, but it flattened the grass. I mean, she said absolutely full. So we know that some of them seem to have been made from the eyewitness accounts. I mean, going back 100 years here and there to having these discs flatten some of the wheat and grain crops. Now, those types of formations, Robert, are pretty simple. They're like simple circles, right?
Right.
So not like the more complicated ones we've seen in recent years. Now, around 2000, we were actually contacted by people who said they could show us how they made them in the daytime for a legal internet advertisement. You know, people make advertisements in the crop over there in the UK. And we didn't think they could do it. We thought, you know, people can't really do this. I mean, there was a lot of circumstantial evidence that it was impossible to make these by hand because there's only about 5 hours of darkness in the UK during the summer. And these are pretty complicated big patterns. Nonetheless, this particular group, led by Matt Williams, in the daytime, legally, the farm for living paid for, did show us they could make a small one. It's something I wrote about in Opening Minds, my book Opening Minds. And it was a small R in an ad sign, not that big, but they did a pretty decent job, and it showed us that maybe some of them could be made by humans. And later on, I was invited that same summer to see some made at night. And again, I wrote about this in Opening Minds. These were not, you know, fields that had been paid for ahead of time. These circle making groups would pick them and go out and put the patterns in that they had designed for a couple of weeks ahead of time. So we did find that humans could make some of them, and especially some of the bigger, complicated patterns. But the really weird thing about it is even some of those affected our cameras and batteries. So it didn't really seem to matter necessarily who had made them, but that something about the shape, the precision and geometry of the shape, would create those anomalous electromagnetic effects. So I had to conclude that even the man-made ones were real, because it affected our cameras and batteries too. I mean, we had seen some of these made at night, and we'd go back and people were having their cameras and batteries affected too. So to answer your question in my long-winded way that I am, there are a couple sources for crop circles. Some of them are unexplained. Some of them seem to be related to flying discs, unexplained aerial phenomena, even balls of light. And some of them nowadays seem to be made by people. I mean, very talented groups of graphics artists who, they're not really hoaxers. I mean, they started by going out trying to see if they could do anything, and they found they could make simple circles. They made them bigger, or they got more complicated, and they found it kind of a challenge to make them bigger. But they really started making them, the ones that I know, because they got tired of waiting out there in the middle of the night for something to happen. So they thought maybe they could communicate with the circle making energy, you know, by going out and making one first, and maybe they get answered. And they just started making more and bigger ones. So the people I know were not doing it as a hoax. They were doing it as kind of a supernatural art form, you know.
Okay, so my next natural next question would be, what's the purpose of it?
Well, it's kind of a big question.
Okay.
We don't know what the purpose was of what we call the original phenomena, right? So the original phenomena would be the ones we can explain from the 1980s, 1970s, and before, back to the 60s and even earlier. And there's a book about this called The Secret History of Crop Circles by Terry Wilson. It's not in print anymore, but if you can find a copy, it's quite good. I mean, it goes into, even in North America, crop circles that have gone back a long ways. And, you know, these are associated with landings of flying discs, unexplained discs, that sort of phenomena. So for those, we don't really know whether it's intentional or a product of the propulsion systems of these flying discs. We don't know who the occupants are of these flying discs. It's a subject we can get into tonight if you're interested.
Of course.
Are they extraterrestrials? Are they coming from a parallel reality, alternate versions of Earth, or something within our own reality that we haven't identified yet, or publicly we don't know what it is, right?
That's right.
So those, we don't really know. I mean, was it kind of, some of these are like they a message, a type of communication, or just the propulsion systems heating up the soil, the grasses that are there. It's a really interesting topic, and I have a lot of questions, but I don't know all the answers. The human ones started out, they were attempting to communicate with these circle-making forces by making small ones, at least the groups that I know in the UK. And they found that they could make them, and they started seeing if they could make them bigger, and they got bigger and bigger throughout the late 80s and 90s into the patterns that we see today. Now, those folks call it natural magic. What they're attempting to do is create a space that people can have a magical experience in. They don't want you to know that they made it. They want it to be left kind of a mystery. And they're artists. Artists often work in secret, right? And they're attempting to create kind of supernatural art that creates a paranormal experience for the people who visit them. So their intentions are, for the most part, pretty good, which are to create a space where people can have a non-ordinary experience. And in a nutshell, I'd say that would be the purpose.
Very interesting. Now, let's get into the aspect of is there connection to UFOs, aliens, and parallel universes, multiverse, alternate reality? Let's talk about this now.
Well, that's a good big question, right? We could spend a couple hours talking about that.
Yeah, we sure could.
I mean, yeah, we don't really know. I mean, look, this UFO experience has been with us at least 120 years now, and going back farther to the Bible. If you look at it from that point of view, you can see pictures of what appear to be UFOs in medieval drawings and paintings throughout history from Europe and other cultures, where there's these objects that look a lot like what we call flying saucers. And the phenomena of crop circles seems to be associated with these phenomena. I mean, where you've had sightings of flying discs, UFOs, things like this, and even, as you mentioned, animal mutilations, sometimes you do find these patterns in the wheat. I mean, I remember speaking to a farmer from Alberta who said he had a lot of mutilated cows, and there were these crop circles in the same area, mysteriously. So there is some association with that. Now, the UFO phenomena has intensified, since World War II, since the development of atomic weapons. Some people have said, UFOs are attracted to nuclear weapons, storage facilities, production facilities, nuclear power plants, like flies, like bees to honey. They just seem to really be concerned about nuclear power. And so where are they coming from? I mean, the sightings have just been increasing decade after decade, starting with the Foo Fighters in World War II, and then they became what's known as ghost rockets that were seen in Sweden around the same time. And then green fireballs in the southwest of the United States. We've seen lots of different shapes, triangular craft, which have been around for a while, but seem to be more frequently seen nowadays, including the sightings of the Phoenix Lights in '97. And so there has been this connection between the crop circles and these discs, because sometimes where you have sightings, you find patterns in the wheat. So then you have to ask the question, are they a type of communication? A lot of the crop circles seem to be based on very rigorous mathematics. And so you have to wonder whether these visitors, wherever they're from, I mean, they may not be all extraterrestrial. It's a story that we've created around the phenomena. Sometimes they say they're extraterrestrial. In the 50s, a lot, the so-called contactees, the inhabitants of these discs and objects would say they were from Venus or Mars or so-and-so. And as far as we know, physically, life isn't really possible the way we know it on Venus. So then it kind of gets into your suggestion there that they're from parallel realities. And that is something that we shouldn't discount. I've been studying this a lot in the past couple of years. I'm giving a couple presentations about multiverses, many worlds theory, and parallel realities in May and June at different science conferences. And I think the multiverse is a very solid contender for the source of some of these beings and objects, because they could come from far away. I mean, a lot farther away than Venus and Mars. Some of them have been there from other star systems and very distant places within our own galaxy, going all the way back to Barney and Betty Hill encounter in New Hampshire in the 60s and even earlier, you know, where these beings show the human visitors like a star map to show them where they're from, show us where they're from. And so maybe some of them are extraterrestrial, but, you know, what I'm really wondering, Robert, are some of them from alternate versions of Earth, you know, in parallel realities that would physically be in the same space you and I are in right now, wherever you are and where I'm here in Boulder, Colorado.
Okay.
Literally in the same space, but at different sort of frequencies, so we don't encounter them directly. And maybe these beings have figured out how to cross over some of these parallel realities to get to ours. And that would sort of explain why they're so concerned with nuclear power and radiation, atomic weapons testing, and so forth, right?
Right.
Because if they're in the same space we are, maybe those weapons are so powerful that they actually breach our reality into theirs and affect them in a negative way that they don't find acceptable, right?
That's right.
And then, yeah, and there's another piece of evidence for parallel realities, which is the farther back you go in UFO history, the older the craft look. I mean, if you look at pictures of these UFOs from the 1950s and 40s, they look pretty old already. So if they're from our future, why do the craft look so old in those pictures? Well, one explanation for that would be that at the time, that was one of the closest parallel realities to the occupants of Earth in the 1940s and 50s. It would have been something related to their reality at the time. And if you notched over a couple channels, a couple parallel realities, those would have been the craft that would have been in the parallel realities to those people at the time, our ancestors from 50, 60, 70 years ago. And that's why the ones we see now look more, you know, modern. They have lots more lights and so forth, because those are parallel realities that are a little closer to us, and those are the types of sightings we have. So I think those are two possible pieces of evidence that what we're seeing are visitors, perhaps even ourselves in future realities, coming to our reality and making themselves known. Now, if they were doing that, perhaps one way to communicate with us, since they probably don't speak our language, English, anymore, if they were from our reality at some point, would be the language of mathematics. And the crop circles do seem to be rigorously, some of them, you know, built around pi ratios, phi ratios, golden means, and so forth, sacred geometry. And that would be one way that, you know, they might attempt to, I don't know, communicate is the right word, but show us that they share some sort of commonality with us through mathematics. It's one way to interpret it. And that could be one of the interpretations of how the shapes of crop circles could relate to extraterrestrials or other sorts of visitors to our reality. And I don't know if that makes any sense or not, but that's one way to look at it.
Yeah, it does. One of my viewers has a question. Has there been any crop circles noticed in the Chernobyl area of Ukraine?
I don't know. If there are, maybe they weren't seen. I'm not certain about that. I know, though, around nuclear facilities, there are a lot of UFOs seen. I believe there was one seen over Fukushima, right, a few years ago?
Okay, yeah.
Aren't there some photos of showing disk or some object nearby?
Yeah.
That people suggested it might have helped the situation. Because I know, you know, where I grew up in New York State as a kid, not far from Montreal, there were a lot of sightings in the Hudson Valley going back decades, but they were particularly around the Indian Point nuclear power plant. July, I believe, June, July 1984, there was a sighting that had involved a number of the security guards there. It was even recorded on video, but the video was never released. A very large triangular craft. These triangular craft were, called the Hudson Valley sightings. Again, it's something I write about in Black Swan Ghost because I've met a couple witnesses who've seen that triangular craft over the Hudson Valley in the 80s, around the time when it was most common. We've never identified what that craft was. Of course, our own FAA and state police from New York suggested they were just Cessna's information, Cessna planes, little planes flying information, but it doesn't seem possible because they were seen on nights where the winds were 30, 40, 50 miles an hour, where Cessnas would not be flying, and certainly not turning on a dime in total silence, right? Simulation doesn't really hold. But that was a large craft. The guards at Indian Point were concerned enough to call the Air Force, which sent out some large helicopters, but the triangle had departed by then. But they were going to start shooting at it, and it was so low, it was only apparently 30 feet over one of the reactor domes, the single dome that was reactor that was active at the time. And it turned out later, we're told that there was a crack in the dome that wasn't known at the time. So perhaps this triangular vehicle was telling us in a way it could that, hey, you should be paying attention, there's a problem here. So whether it happened over Chernobyl, I'm not familiar with, and I'm not familiar with any crop circles at the time. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, but I'm not directly familiar with it. But it's a good question because they have been seen around these reactors and certainly around reactor disasters. This goes all the way back to the 40s to the weapons production for the Manhattan Project, Hanford and Oak Ridge, lots of sightings and so forth. Jets are scrambled and everything. So it's really something that's very obvious, Robert. Someone is attempting to communicate with us about the implications of radiation and nuclear power, and possibly through crop circles also. But it's important to remember that this is a two-way street. So it's not just that the crop circles show up and we go, wow, isn't that amazing? They are amazing. But someone suggested, Pepper Lewis suggested that she's a channel, by the way, for a channel called Mother Earth. And we did a channeling session with her, and the entity, who's named Mother Earth, suggested that these were a type of language, crop circles, that were being taught to us. We were kind of like children, and these visitors were kind of like the adults, and they were attempting to teach us a new language through crop circles of mathematics. So that's another way to look at it, right?
Right. Wow, that's fascinating. I never heard of that. There could be a new type of language, but how do we read this language of crop circles? How do we learn about it and speak about it?
Well, it's a good question. I don't have all the answers to that, but okay. It does appear that crop circles stretch our imagination. They get us thinking about things in new ways. Just for an example, when I was in graduate school and I was working on my dissertation, we did I looked at something called fractal geometry. This is the geometry of nature, the geometry of natural shapes, things that are not shaped like lines, but more like mountains and clouds and our own hair and things, river systems, things that are broken up into lots of fine structures that the closer you look, the more fine grained they are and the more branching structures, like a tree. A tree is a fractal shape, right?
Right.
And so I studied this as an alternative way of looking at the world compared to the linear types of statistics that I was being taught at the time. And I got really interested in these fractal shapes, especially because if you look at everything nature does, it builds them around fractal shapes. Now, modern humans build everything around lines for the most part, right? And regular shapes like squares and circles. And those sorts of things are particularly fragile because they're too linear and they're efficient like roads because they're good for cars, but they're also destructive because they allow flooding and the water can't go anywhere. I was here in Boulder in 2013 when there was a big flood. And I'll tell you, those roads that are so good at moving cars around also are good at moving water around right into your house. So things that we built have defects in them that are not found in nature because we like things to be straight and flat and smooth, right?
Right.
And that's our idea of comfort. But it's also, there's a downside, which is it's a little too flat, it's a little too smooth. And if you've ever been in an airport, when a couple planes are delayed, all the flights are delayed for the rest of the day. So they're also particularly fragile and not very resilient, right? These smooth, efficient structures. Nature builds things around structures that are resilient. If a tree loses a branch, it's got 8 or 9 or 20 other branches. So it's designed to survive. And it doesn't look as straight, but nature didn't want it to be that way. It wanted it to be fractured and fractalized. Also, fractal systems are good at absorbing and transforming energy because there's more surface area than on a completely flat surface. If you have a lot of branches and a lot of smaller branches and a lot of leaves, you're going to get 3, 4, 5 times as much surface area as just a flat structure. And that's so the tree can absorb sunlight. So these fractal systems have a lot of advantages, and we come along and flatten them. Anyway, this is what I studied in sociology. I was looking at the drawbacks of some of our modern technology, the way it can go wrong so easily. I mean, remember during Y2K in the year 2000, we thought there was going to be like, you know, everything was going to stop because the devices could, yeah. Well, it didn't really happen except a couple places here and there, but that's the kind of thing that can go wrong with the way we build things, you know. In any case, when I got to England in 1997, some of those crop circles, particularly one by Silbury Hill, the Coke Snowflake as it's called, was one, I mean, it was 300 feet across and it was a fractal shape. The edges kept going into smaller and smaller iterations, right? It was like a star, but if you look at the edges, there were more stars on the edges, and to a point, you could keep magnifying it. That's one of the fractals I studied in my dissertation. So I thought this was really cool because I'd only seen it in a book, a couple inches across, right? And they would save printer's ink by leaving out the middle because it was all, you know, filled in. Here it was the size of a football field next to Silbury Hill, which is the oldest and biggest earth mound in Europe. It's a huge man-made pyramid from 5,000 years ago. And here was this huge fractal shape. Robert, it kind of blew my mind. And so the types of shapes are really connected to some sort of meaning, and a lot of crop circles are built around these fractal shapes. Now, I want to suggest something here about what they do. I personally feel, based on all my research, that crop circles are waveguides. They're acting like waveguides because of the fractal, self-similar. They have a lot of branches, and those branches break into smaller branches, and it's symmetrical. They look a lot like crystals. And I think that they act like crystals to transform energy and information from one frequency to another. And so that is kind of what these UFOs do, and these visitors, they seem to be able to shift frequencies. You know, they seem to pop in and pop out sometimes.
Yeah.
So I think that the crop circles are either literally acting like waveguides or resembling waveguides enough. Fractals are not just natural shapes. Every cell phone has a fractal antenna in it so it can receive different frequencies. The antennas in cell phones now look like fractals. They have smaller and smaller self-similar shapes based around squares and different types of shapes. And the crop circles are based like that. So there are a lot of them. A lot of them that have, where we've seen a lot of the battery failure, is where you have the fractal shapes. So my feeling is simply that crop circles act like waveguides for light and other frequencies of electromagnetic energy, and they're transforming it from one frequency to another, and that's why it affects our cameras, devices, and batteries, and so forth. Now, I can't prove that, but that's the way I'm looking at it, because I don't know any other explanation that would explain why you get all that weird phenomena around crop circles, stuff that I've personally seen. And again, if you go to newcrystalmind.com, which is my blog, the first entry right now about our crop circle tour, I have a link right in the middle of that post. It's called Crop Circle Weirdness, and it's about 6-7 videos I've taken of our tour guests having their camera stop working right when I was there, and I could film it, or other people that I met in the crop circle. And you just go in, and all of a sudden they say, "Hey, my camera just stopped, and what's going on? You know, and you're there, you turn on camera. I have about 6, 7, 8 of those videos. It's fascinating. So to me, Robert, crop circles are a type of technology, a natural technology, perhaps created originally by visitors, ETs, people from other dimensions, or someone, ourselves in the future, and that humans learned how to replicate the pattern and work with it, and it became a type of communication, in a sense, between us. So as you can see, I'm favorable to the man-made circles. I think it's part of the phenomena. I know a lot of people, and you don't seem like one of them, Robert. Some people are very defensive about it, and they don't want anything to do with man-made crop circles, right? They think it's, you know, it's kind of taking the phenomena and polluting it a little bit, right? They want it to be pure extraterrestrial, whatever that means. And they don't want it to be diluted with anything man-made. That's not the way I interpret it. And I know this is not a popular position, but I don't care. This is the way I see it. It's meant to be an interactive phenomena, and they could be made by many things, and I'm perfectly happy. We've made many ourselves. If you go to cropcirclescience.com, which is another one of my websites, there's a lot of pictures of ones that we've made over the years. We've paid farmers and gone out and made them over a couple of days just to see what happens. And we've found some of these effects in our own circles. We made one in Kansas once. We had permission to make a small one, and all of the photos came out really strange. You can see that at cropcirclescience.com. All of the photos just were bizarre looking, and that camera had never done that before. Looks like there's some energy there. It's just weird. And so anyway, we found this many times, and it's like the formation acts like a waveguide, and it's taking light or other electromagnetic energy and shifting it to different frequencies in a way that our electronics doesn't like. And so your photos become weird, or your camera stops working. So something like that. It's a type of advanced technology that's very similar to crystals and crystal-like technologies, right? That are basically allowing us to communicate right now, right? They're in our computers, they're in our phones, and all of our electronics are based around crystal patterns. And these crystals are very, very accurate and precise at tuning frequencies and creating, you know, resonance, basically. Resonance that we can tune to a specific frequency and find useful. And to me, the crop circles have a lot to do with resonance, like a resonant shape, kind of like a musical instrument, but it's just creating other types of frequencies that we can't necessarily hear, but our technology, our cameras, batteries, laptops, cell phones can interact with that frequency, maybe in a way that's unexpected. I mean, it may not work again, but at least you wow, you know, what is going on there? So there's something really interesting about it that way.
Okay, wow, that's very fascinating about the crop circles. About it's man-made, but I've heard of that also. That some of them could be man-made. I've read that up also in the past. So,
right.
If people don't like it, well, it's their problem. I mean, if that's the case, that it's both man-made and extraterrestrial, that's what it is. That's what it is. You know, you can't just sugarcoat everything, you know, from the truth.
Yeah, I agree. The truth is more important than any of our particular bias, right?
Right.
I'm happy to be proved wrong. There was a time I didn't think people could make them. I would get up on stage at conferences and say I knew all the evidence and reasons why people couldn't make them, but that turned out to be wrong. They did make them. And they showed me at night they could make them, and they showed us bigger and bigger ones. And we found out there were people that were really interested in crop circles. And here's another thing, Robert. The people that make the crop circles, and for most part, their names are not known. We know the names of Matt Williams because he was actually caught making one. He wasn't really caught, but he told the farmer he had made it, and the farmer wasn't totally happy. It was a new farmer who he didn't know on the field, and they turned him in. But the judge fined him about £200 and told him not to do it again. He's the only one who's ever been caught doing it. He sent us the patterns ahead of time and everything. But these guys who've done it have told us, and different ones have told me this, they have seen really strange things in there at night when they're out there. They've seen balls of light, even to the extent that the balls of light have chased them out of the field before they could make the circle. I mean, a couple balls of light would approach them and scare them away. It's happened. Other people have told me that they've seen triangular craft, small craft, 5 or 6 feet on each side, come over the circles while they're working. I mean, what are those? Are they drones? Are they military drones? Are they reconnaissance vehicles from extraterrestrial craft? I don't know, but they've seen these things. They've also experienced temporal anomalies where their watches don't seem properly calibrated at the end of the evening, things like that. So even these human circle makers, I mean, call them professional circle makers because they've made so many, have told us that they've experienced very, out of the ordinary experiences while they're making them. So I think we should take some of those stories to heart and consider that there's something quite real about the whole phenomena, as you're saying, whether it's man-made or not.
Right, that's right. I have a question, other questions, moving all along from crop circles. What is remote viewing, and how did you get into this?
Is that a listener question?
No, it's my question.
Oh, my question. Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Remote viewing is the ability for you or me to perceive information in a way that's not easy to explain from a distant source, physically distant source, right?
Right.
So it's the ability for you or me to somehow know what's going on about something far away from us without using our eyes or ears or any conventional means. And some people call it anomalous cognition. That's what Dr. Ed May calls it, who was in charge of the project for a while. Now, the reason we know about this, it's not a new thing, and it goes back to Patanjali from the Yoga Sutras from India from thousands of years ago. They talked about these abilities that humans had. The easiest way to understand what it is when you get an intuitive or gut feeling to call your family or friends or something, and then they tell you there was a reason for it. Sometimes people have a family member pass on, and they just get this feeling that they need to call someone, and they find out that someone has just passed over, things like that. Sometimes you get it before an accident or something, and you change your direction on the road or take another path or go on a different exit. So it's that kind of intuitive feeling we get a few minutes before something happens or after something's happened that's important to us that we don't have any direct way of knowing about. And this ability seems built into all of us, You could call it ESP or psychic, whatever you want. But the way we found out about it in recent times is the US military discovered that the Russians in the 60s had been experimenting with psychokinesis, the ability to move things at a distance with just your mind. And remote viewers to spy on the United States potentially. And the US military and government wanted to disprove it because they didn't want to feel that during the Cold War with the Soviet Union that the Russians could somehow spy on us psychically, right?
Right.
So they had physicists at Stanford Research Institute